By December of 1863, the American Civil War was well into its final act, as Union troops pierced deep into the heart of the Confederacy. While Sherman and Johnston elegantly fenced in Georgia, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee were exchanging hammer blows in Virginia. Grant intended to swiftly confront and destroy Lee in battle, while crushing the Confederacy from all fronts. When Lee refused to give him that battle, Grant switched tactics and simply began grinding him down. This strategy did put Lincoln's re-election in jeopardy, but through determination and superior strategic vision, Grant was ultimately successful. Welcome to our latest video on the bloodiest conflict ever fought on American soil, in which the two greatest generals of the Civil War will joust in the bloody and fiery Overland campaign. Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons: the Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. As 1864 dawned, Grant's military division of the Mississippi didn't have anything to do. The only strategic target remaining between Kansas and the Appalachians was Mobile, Alabama, which was the responsibility of the Navy and Nathaniel Banks. Grant was still in charge of destroying the Army of Tennessee, but it had fled his jurisdiction to defend Atlanta. Grant had been in trouble for leaving his military district once before, and didn't want to repeat. He knew that President Lincoln and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck would approve his march into Georgia, but he had to present his request correctly and propose a well-structured plan first. It was here that Lincoln surprised Grant. For all his skill at military politics and administration, Henry Halleck was not a leader of men. He had never provided strategic vision or leadership and struggled to get generals to follow orders. Consequently, Lincoln was thoroughly fed up with his general-in-chief. In contrast, Grant had proven to be Halleck's opposite, and his demonstrated ability to victoriously coordinate armies through the Chattanooga campaign sealed the deal. At the end of February, Lincoln telegraphed Grant informing him that he had been made general-in-chief. Halleck was shunted sideways to the new position of Chief of Staff. To prevent conflicts over seniority, Grant was promoted to Lieutenant General, the first American to hold this office since George Washington. Grant arrived in D.C. on March 8th and accepted his promotion, on the condition that Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton agreed not to interfere with his upcoming campaigns. Grant would fully inform them of his movements and consult them on overall strategy, but once bullets started flying, they were to stay out. Grant hoped to bring the war to a swift and decisive conclusion, but knew it could get extremely bloody. He had to be allowed to fight the war his way, without political hand-wringing, no matter how severely it threatened Lincoln's re-election. Having learned his lesson, Lincoln readily agreed, but Stanton was more resistant. Grant's strategy was characteristically straightforward. Jefferson Davis's government was irrelevant. The Confederacy was actually held together by the existence of the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee. If those armies were destroyed, the Confederacy would end. In order to destroy them, Union armies would finally launch the simultaneous attack that McClellan had envisioned, but never implemented. William T. Sherman was given command of the Mississippi Division to destroy the Army of Tennessee and capture Atlanta. Nathaniel Banks had been supposed to take Mobile, but instead went adventuring up the Red River. Smaller departments were to strike the Carolina coast and Florida, but the main focus was Virginia. Grant intended for the Army of the Potomac to quickly destroy the Army of Northern Virginia in battle south of the Wilderness. However, Robert E. Lee was unlikely to fall so easily. Therefore, Benjamin Butler's Army of the James would advance from Fort Monroe to threaten Lee's rear and take Richmond. Simultaneously, Franz Sigel's Army of the Shenandoah would cut Lee's supply base in Shenandoah Valley before swinging east onto Lee's flank. Finally, Union forces in West Virginia were to move south and destroy the railways, lead mines and salt works in Western Virginia before continuing east to join Sigel. Lee couldn't be everywhere, and the pressure from nearly 200,000 Federals would eventually overwhelm the 90,000 total Confederates in Virginia. These movements couldn't be perfectly synced, so instead they were to begin within the first 2 weeks of May. George Meade had expected to be relieved of command of the Army of the Potomac, but Grant retained him. Believing it would be irresponsible of himself to oversee the entire war and the day-to-day running of an army, Grant attached his headquarters to Meade's and directed the army's strategic movements, but allowed Meade to remain in charge of tactical decisions and army administration. Grant respected Meade's abilities and never undermined his chain of command, always delivering orders to Meade's headquarters instead of unit commanders. Grant's orders were, "Wherever Lee goes, there you will also go." As soon as the roads were dry, Meade was to move out and destroy Lee with superior numbers. Meade agreed to this task, but there were problems. The Orange and Alexandria Railroad was exposed to Jeb Stuart's cavalry raids, making it a questionable supply line. Additionally, he'd have to pass through the wilderness and risk another Chancellorsville. Grant addressed the former by claiming that they would plan around river logistics, and the latter by admitting that such a possibility was unavoidable. Union forces would simply have to move quickly enough to clear the forest before Lee noticed. Finally, the army needed reorganization. Most veteran units were now well below half strength and would muster out by September. They would eventually be replaced, but with so many individual units, command would become unwieldy. Therefore, Grant combined the veteran regiments and consolidated the army into 3 infantry and 1 cavalry corps. Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps would accompany Meade, but remain outside his command. Grant and Meade further agreed that the campaign should be finished before the personnel changeover peaked in July. To help ease the manpower crunch, Grant converted the unused heavy artillery regiments in DC's fortifications to infantry. By May 3rd, the roads were dry. The following day, Grant's 120,000 troops crossed the Rapidan at Germanna and Ellie's fords, his cavalry driving away Confederate pickets and screening the infantry's advance. Wilson's 3rd Division continued on to Wilderness Tavern, while Gregg's 2nd Division first secured Chancellorsville, then moved on to occupy Aldrich. Grant hoped to be through the wilderness by evening, but the army's size and narrow roads caused it to string out and slow down. To make matters worse, Lee had anticipated the movement. In response, the Southern general positioned A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell's corps to intercept any move through the wilderness, and spread out to intercept Grant wherever he crossed. Longstreet was south at Gordonsville, in case of a sweeping move through Shenandoah or an amphibious landing. Lee saw Meade's movement early on March 4th, and ordered Longstreet to rejoin him, while Hill and Ewell moved to engage. Lee hoped to fight another Chancellorsville, or at the very least, hold Meade in the wilderness. Lee's army was back to 65,000 soldiers after absorbing a number of smaller commands, but he knew no more recruits were coming. This was his only chance to nullify the numerical disparity between his Confederate forces and the Union Expedition Force, but he needed Longstreet to close the trap. Meade expected Lee to fight behind Mine Run. Erroneous reports about Stuart's activities caused him to send most of his cavalry to Fredericksburg. When the 3rd Division encountered Hill's vanguard south of Parker's Store, the dense vegetation made them think it was only pickets. The armies camped 2 miles apart, largely unaware of each other. At 0500, 500 Union cavalrymen began patrolling down Orange Plank Road. Dismounting due to overhanging trees, they quickly discovered Hill's advancing corps. The troopers raised the alarm while using their Spencer repeating carbines to slow Hill's advance. Meade directed the 5th Corps to engage via the Orange Turnpike, believing it only faced a division. In fact, Ewell was holding back per Lee's orders to wait for Longstreet, and had dug in behind Saunders Field. Concerned about moving through the forest, Governor Warren tried to delay the attack, but Meade ordered him forward at 1300. As Warren feared, the attack was repulsed with bloodshed as his brigades became disjointed and isolated in the trees. The Confederates unleashed a storm of lead, emerging from the trees as individual brigades, rather than launching a unified attack. The Union left fell apart as it advanced through a swamp, and Confederates advanced into gaps in the line. In the center, the Iron Brigade successfully broke through the front line, but became isolated and routed once attacked on 3 sides. The heavy fighting set Saunders Field on fire, which began spreading into the forest. Hundreds of trapped, wounded men were burned to death as their comrades fought to a stalemate. The 6th Corps arrived at 15:30, stabilizing the Union front as both sides traded attacks until nightfall. To the south, the Union cavalry patrol was pushed back to the critical Orange Plank and Brock Road intersection. If Hill could take that intersection, he would drive a wedge between the 2nd and 5th Corps. The 2nd Corps had to navigate a long, winding wagon road to get there, so Meade dispatched Getty's division from the 6th Corps to hold the crossroads at 10:30. Hill attacked at noon, but failed to make any headway. The 2nd Corps finally arrived at 15:30 and counterattacked, forcing Hill to move into defensive positions as a stalemate ensued at nightfall. During the night, soldiers desperately raced against the spreading fires to rescue thousands of trapped wounded. Uniform color no longer mattered, only escaping the flames mattered. The following day, Grant ordered Meade to attack at 0500, as their strategy depended on forcing Lee to fight. However, Ewell attacked first to keep Grant pinned until Longstreet arrived, and bitter but inconclusive fighting rocked the Union's right flank. On the left, Meade had positioned the reserves against Hill's left flank. The attack at 0500 pushed Hill back, and the Confederate artillery fired through their retreating troops to slow the Federal advance. As Hill began to crumble, Longstreet arrived at the head of the Texas Brigade. Despite marching since 0100, the Texans surged forward, only to halt when a relieved and excited Lee rode forward as if to lead them. The Texans refused to advance until Lee agreed to withdraw from danger to the rear. This delay allowed more northern brigades to arrive, prompting Longstreet to order a counterattack. The Texans stormed the Federal line in front of Widow Tapp's farm. Of 800 Texans who charged, only 250 returned, but the Confederate front stabilized. The morning mists, combined with wood and gun smoke, created an impenetrable haze that limited visibility to barely 10 feet, and the lines were increasingly intermixed. At 1000, Longstreet's engineers discovered the Union left was exposed due to miscommunication. Using newly arrived brigades, Longstreet assaulted the left, and the Union line was pressed back to Brock Road. As victory appeared imminent, Longstreet rode forward to discern what was happening in the haze. However, the confusion caused his units to start firing on each other, and the general was caught in the friendly crossfire. Longstreet was wounded, and several of his staff were killed. Burnside arrived and counterattacked Longstreet's flank. Wildfires surged towards Brock Road, allowing the Confederates to claim the burning breastworks before being driven back again, and the fighting became another confused stalemate. At 17:30, a final attack against the Union right pushed the line back a mile, until darkness and approaching wildfires forced an end to the fighting. During the night, both armies built fortifications, while again trying to save the wounded from the fires. That night, Grant concluded that attacking in the burning wilderness was stupid, but the route south towards Richmond was still open. Resultingly, he decided to hold his position to let Lee attack. However, if Lee did not attack, then Meade was to disengage and flank Lee via Spotsylvania Courthouse. Lee came to the same conclusion once he realized that Grant wasn't attacking. Both generals ordered their cavalry to capture Todd's Tavern, which was the shortest route to Spotsylvania. Jeb Stuart and Philip Sheridan's troopers had been skirmishing in the area for days already, and clashed in earnest on May 7th. The swirling mounted duel was inconclusive, and resumed the next day. Sheridan's superior numbers began to tell, just as Hill's corps began to arrive, forcing Sheridan to retire. Lee consequently won the race to Spotsylvania, but only just, with Sheridan keeping him from taking the best positions. Morale was low in the Army of the Potomac on May 7th. The veterans had been here before, literally and figuratively. They had clashed with Lee, been bloodied, and now figured they would retreat behind a river to regroup. The orders to disengage confirmed it, until they were supplemented with orders to march south. They weren't beaten, and the campaign was continuing. Morale soared so high that they sang on the march. As the main cavalry forces clashed at Todd's Tavern, Wesley Merritt and Fitzhugh Lee's troopers were trying to break the impasse by flanking towards Spotsylvania. At dawn on May 8th, Merritt assaulted Lee's barricades on Brock Road, and was repulsed until the 5th Corps' lead division arrived to smash through and press on towards Confederate trenches on a low ridge past Spindle Farm. Thinking he faced only dismounted cavalry, Warren ordered a full assault. In truth, Longstreet's corps had arrived, and the attacks were bloodily repulsed. As more troops began arriving, Union cavalry flanked the Confederate line to occupy Spotsylvania Courthouse, but no infantry support arrived. With Confederate infantry approaching, they were forced to retreat. Meade was frustrated with all his officers' recent performances, and the cavalry's failure to secure Spotsylvania meant Sheridan received a chewing out that turned into a firestorm, as Sheridan's temper equaled Meade's. Meade roared about Sheridan's mediocre results, while Sheridan roared back about Meade's refusal to unleash his corps, declaring that he could whip Stuart if allowed. Realizing that the two generals would tear the army apart, Grant intervened and convinced Meade to let Sheridan prove that he could walk the walk after talking the talk. As night fell, both armies trickled in and began extending their trench lines. By the morning of May 9th, the Confederates had built 4 miles of trenches between the Po and Knee rivers, with a prominent salient called the Mule Shoe. The Federals built their own parallel lines. At 0900, General Sedgwick fatally taunted fate while personally placing the 6th Corps batteries. The lines were roughly 1,000 yards apart, and cannon and sharpshooters were trading shots, causing both the soldiers and their staff to cringe for cover. Boldly striding around to reassure them, he declared they couldn't hit an elephant at this range. He was shot in the face moments later. As the lines took shape, Grant correctly guessed that Lee was shifting his lines eastward. This left their left flank exposed, and he ordered Hancock's 2nd Corps to cross the Po and attack. However, fearing the defences at Blockhouse Bridge, Hancock ordered a halt to bring up his artillery for a morning attack. Unfortunately, this alerted Lee, who moved 2 divisions to block Hancock. Meanwhile, Sheridan's 10,000 troopers and 32 cannons had launched their raid to defeat Stuart, disrupt Lee's supply lines, and distract Lee by threatening Richmond. Stuart's 5,000 troopers pursued, as Sheridan moved towards Lee's supply base at Beaver Dam Station. As dawn broke on May 10th, Grant realized that Lee had fixed his positions, and Hancock was now exposed. He was ordered to fall back, then redeploy so that the whole army could attack at 1700. Hancock withdrew successfully, but for reasons unknown, Meade authorized Warren to attack early, which ultimately failed. This botched assault delayed the general attack until 1800. Despite heavy artillery support, the attacks proceeded and were repulsed, with one exception. Colonel Emory Upton had convinced Warren to let him try the innovative tactic of running across the field and not firing until they were in the opposing trenches. Upton's assault succeeded in breaching the defences, but the supporting troops fled, and a determined counterattack drove Upton back. Impressed by Upton's results, Grant ordered Meade to adopt the same tactic on May 11th. While Hancock assaulted the Mule Shoe, the remaining corps would launch supporting attacks along the rest of the line to pin down Confederate reserves. Lee misinterpreted Grant's preparations as a preparation for a withdrawal and pulled his artillery out of the Mule Shoe to get ready to pursue Grant. Meanwhile, Sheridan had reached Beaver Dam Station to find the supplies already removed or destroyed, but did rescue 400 Union prisoners. Continuing on towards Richmond, he found Stuart waiting for him at Yellow Tavern. Despite the Union's artillery and superior Spencer repeating carbines, Stuart's troops tenaciously resisted from a low ridge. At about 1500, Stuart personally led the 1st Virginia Cavalry in a mounted charge, which forced advancing dismounted Federals to retreat. Still, Private John Huff turned and mortally wounded Stuart with his pistol. The Confederates withdrew an hour later. Sheridan's raid continued away from Richmond, where he reached Butler's army on May 14th. Hancock attacked the Mule Shoe's Peak on May 12th at 0435, proceeding through thick mist, while Burnside launched his supporting attack on its right flank. Hancock's troops smashed through, annihilating the defending division. Confederate reinforcements rushed in, and hand-to-hand fighting ensued. In a scene eerily prescient of the Western Front 50 years later, the fighting devolved into a bloody brawl. Attacks along the Confederate left accomplished nothing, forcing all the focus onto a section of trenches remembered as Bloody Angle. For the next 24 hours, Grant and Lee fed troops into Bloody Angle, until both sides were fighting atop layers of dead men. Bullets flew so thickly that rifle fire cut trees down. Rain began falling, turning the trenches into a quagmire of mud and blood, as men struggled against each other in close quarters. By the morning, the Union stood triumphant on the parapets, only to find that Lee's engineers had built a second line behind Mule Shoe. Before long, both sides had grown too exhausted to keep fighting, and everyone pulled back. While Grant remained undeterred, he recognized that his men had reached their limit. He wired Washington, "The enemy are obstinate and seemed to have found the last ditch." Worse still, the rains continued, making further action impossible. Over the next week, Grant avoided direct confrontation with Lee. Instead, he continually shifted the trenches eastward, hoping to force his opponent into unfavorable positions. Lee wasn't fooled and continued improving his lines while extending his right flank to counter Grant. Hoping that Lee had thinned his line, Grant attacked Mule Shoe again on May 18th, but got nowhere. This convinced Grant to give up the fight and pull out to flank Lee's right, this time aiming to get behind him via Hanover Junction. Lee sensed something was up, but instead of sending out a cavalry patrol, he had Ewell make a reconnaissance in force against Hancock on May 19th, which gained nothing but more casualties. Grant disengaged during the night of May 20th. As Grant turned south, news arrived that was not so good. Sigel had been defeated and fled from an inferior force. Moreover, the Western Virginia raid was destroying tracks and disrupting salt production, but hadn't received the explosives to destroy the railway bridges or collapse the mines completely. After Sigel's retreat, the raiders were left isolated and forced to withdraw into West Virginia. Butler had easily taken Bermuda Hundred, but moved too slowly against Richmond. His 33,000 troops should have easily overwhelmed Richmond's 5,000 defenders, but he'd overcautiously, though successfully, probed forward. This advance allowed PGT Beauregard to arrive from South Carolina with 18,000 troops to block his advance. The geography of Bermuda Hundred meant that Butler couldn't be attacked, but neither could he attack. In fact, defense was so strongly favored that Beauregard sent 10,000 unneeded troops to reinforce Lee. A frustrated Grant described Butler as being corked in a wine bottle. Cleverness was failing him again, so it was time for brute force. Grant had kept attrition as his backup strategy, and now it was time to put it into action. He informed Meade that the prospects for a decisive battle appeared remote, so rather than constantly seeking an advantage, they would simply fight Lee wherever he chose to fight. That fight came on May 23rd. Meade left Hancock behind as bait to keep Lee from disengaging, but Lee didn't bite. Instead, he marched right past Warren's unaware corps and seized the North Anna crossings before Grant arrived. However, the seizure of that town did not stop Warren and Hancock from successfully crossing and defending their bridgeheads at Jericho Mills and Chesterfield Bridge against counterattacks. Lee adopted a V-shaped fortified line, which he intended to use to execute a reverse of the Gettysburg strategy. He would concentrate his forces against whichever Union wing struck first, crush it, and then crush the other. However, Lee had heart disease, which caused diarrhea that incapacitated him for the next week. With Longstreet wounded and A.P. Hill sick, there was no general able to execute the plan, and 3 days of ineffective skirmishing ensued. Grant interpreted Lee's lack of initiative as proof that the Union Army was almost spent. With the current position too unfavorable, he again ordered Meade to disengage and swing around Lee's left flank. Sheridan had just returned, having accomplished only one of his tasks. Grant immediately had Sheridan probe Lee's left flank, successfully convincing him that Grant was moving west. Instead, he moved south again, aiming for the Cold Harbor crossroads. When he realized that Grant had slipped away in the night, Lee force marched to Totopotomoy Creek, just beating Grant on May 28th. On May 30th, Hill's corps ineffectually assaulted Warren's exposed position. Grant realized that another stalemate was beginning and again flanked towards Cold Harbor. The cavalry had been brawling near Old Cold Harbor, and on May 31st, Sheridan's troopers seized the crossroads. Lee attempted to push him out on June 1st, only for Meade's corps to arrive from the north, while Union reinforcements arrived from the south. At 1830, Grant ordered a general attack that was able to push Lee back slightly. On June 2nd, the army's exhaustion precluded any attack, but Grant still believed that Lee was on his last legs. Therefore, the whole army was to attack at dawn on June 3rd, but Grant did not give specific orders to launch the assault. Instead, the corps commanders were expected to use their judgment about the enemy in front of them. However, none of them did adequate reconnaissance before the attack. At 0430, the advance began, and by 0700 they were finished. Overconfidence and complacency led the corps commanders to attack into the teeth of Lee's defences, suffering 7,000 casualties and inflicting only 1,500. The attacks were simply cut down by Confederate crossfire, though a few units pierced the Confederate right's front line. Meade's attempt to exploit the breaches failed, and 9 days of grinding trench warfare ensued. The Northern press shredded Lincoln for supporting Grant, demonizing Grant as a butcher. Consequently, Union morale hit its nadir. After these events, Lincoln assumed his re-election was already a lost cause. Only Grant was undeterred. The Shenandoah campaign was now successfully proceeding under new leadership, and another opportunity had presented itself. Hoping to redeem himself, Butler observed Confederates leaving their fortifications at Petersburg to reinforce Lee. An assault on Petersburg via the James could flank all manned defences. Petersburg's 5 railways were Richmond's lifeline. Take Petersburg and Richmond would starve. To help him, Grant sent Sheridan off on another raid on June 7th. Butler successfully dispatched forces to Petersburg, but timid subordinates engaged rather than stormed the defences as Butler ordered on June 9th. Sheridan fought another inconclusive battle at Trevilian Station on June 11th, which drew Lee's attention away from Grant. The night of June 14th, Meade's engineers built the longest pontoon bridge of the war over the James, and on June 15th, the siege of Petersburg began. The Overland campaign was brutal. Historians have found numerous instances of over- and undercounting casualties on both sides, which were exacerbated by the wilderness fires. Grant suffered between 38,691 and 65,000 casualties, representing between 32 and 52% of his starting strength. Lee suffered 20 to 40,000 casualties, comprising 31 to 61% of his initial army. Grant had sent an additional 50,000 men home, but as he entered the siege lines, his army swelled back towards 120,000 and kept growing. A new recruit replaced every soldier Grant lost. He'd wanted to avoid a war of attrition, but now that it had arrived, he was certain to win, despite the political danger to Lincoln. Lee's army was back to 60,000 troops, but only because he'd pulled troops from other fronts. The endgame had arrived, and to Lee's horror, it would be down to attrition, a fight he couldn't win. With Lee confined to siege lines, the Confederacy tilted towards collapse. Join us next time as the Confederacy turns to increasingly desperate offensives to reverse its crumbling fortunes. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.